Thank you for coming this evening to come and discuss the Caste legislation amendment that's going to be happening later on this year. I will introduce the evening just shortly. For those of you who've never been to a Vichaar Manthan before, Vichaar Manthan, I said literally in Sanskrit, means the churning of ideas, the churning of thoughts. The whole point of Vichaar Manthan is not to really provide any particular solution, but to allow a platform, a Hindu platform, to discuss earnest ideas. It's run by a group of volunteers, and we've come together essentially because we felt that there was a gap in the landscape where to discuss philosophical Hindu ideas was lacking. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers and this evening, I request everybody to please check and switch your phones off. So let's move on to this evening. Today we have three very, very distinguished speakers, three people who know this topic very, very well. And the first person I'm going to introduce is our chair for this evening, Anuja Prashar. Anuja Prashar sitting in the center. She has a BA in economics from the University of Michigan in the States. She has a master's in race and ethnic relations from Birkbeck College at the University of London. And she is a doctoral student right now studying globalization and CSR at the Open University here in the UK. Anuja ji was born in Kenya, and she's lived in Beckenham for about 30 years. And in fact, in the last election, she ran as a Liberal Democrat potential MP for that constituency. Anuja ji has been lecturing in higher education for the past 10 years on international business, emerging economies, global management, globalization, political identity and nationalism, and cross-cultural communication. So, a big round of applause for Anuja ji. Our next distinguished speaker is Mr. Satpal Muman. Satpal ji is the current chairman and co-founder of CasteWatch UK. The organization was established in 2003 to create awareness of caste-based discrimination occurring in the UK. Mr. Muman has been on the forefront of the British campaign to make caste-based discrimination unlawful in Britain, and he has been advocating the legislation that is being discussed currently within our parliament. So Mr. Muman will be presenting a case this evening for us as to why essentially the nature of the discrimination that happens on the basis of caste and why this legislation is the right way to go. Mr. Muman is also the secretary of the Ambedkar International Mission, a position he's held since 1988. He is a freelance as an IT professional for over 20 years. He's worked for major multinational companies, both in the States and here. And he works as a technology specialist for a major high street UK bank. So please round of applause for Mr. Muman. And finally, our third speaker, Dr. Prakash Shah. Dr. Prakash Shah specializes in legal pluralism, religion, law, and ethnic minorities and diasporas in law, immigration, refugee and nationality law, and comparative law with special reference to South Asia. He has published widely and lectured internationally. Dr. Shah was a lecturer at SOAS, a university in London, from 1993. He's been a lecturer at Canterbury in August 2000. He recently joined Queen Mary's University, I say recently in 2002, where right now he's a reader in culture and law. Dr. Shah is also a director of GLO CUL, the Center for Culture and Law at Queen Mary's. Dr. Shah stance on this is that he believes that this legislation that is being discussed is not necessary and will be putting up a case against the legislation. Please round of applause for Dr. Shah. Now, the nature of this evening is that this pretty much will be construed as a debate, as a debate and then a discussion. Essentially, each of the speakers will make their opening statements, opening remarks. The chair will have an opportunity to dig deeper into some of the subtle issues that are raised. Thereafter, there will be plenty of opportunity for you to submit and ask your questions to our speakers. So while the Vichaar Manthan is happening, I request all of you, you'd have been given a piece of paper to write down any questions that you want to ask. And essentially, we will have a break, a 10-minute break, once both speakers and the chair have gone through their manthan. At that moment, two ushers will come by the aisles. Please submit your questions into them. And then we will give it to the chair. And of course, depending on time and the number of questions we have to get through, the chair will decide, obviously, which questions she can ask and address directly to the two debaters. So that will be the nature of the program, followed by a closing remarks from both of our speakers, and then concluding. We hope to finish by just after 8 o'clock. Without any further ado, I will pass you over to Anuja ji.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure and an honor to have been invited to speak today and to chair what I think is going to be an extremely interesting debate. I think I've been invited to speak to this because they believe that I may have acquired a few diplomatic skills over the last 10 years of my political career. We shall be tested today. The other reason is because in 2005, when I got involved with the Hindu Council, Hindu Forum, and the Interfaith Network through the Home Office, I did some research into transnational networks of conversion, and the caste debate was then just coming to the fore. And I realized that there was a slight connection. I was therefore present at the first consultation that the government had with the communities on caste discrimination. And at that stage, the whole issue was put to bed and put to rest. And that was in 2005. So since then, I've gone on to do a lot of other political activity with Europe and with the Liberal Democrats. And so I am as curious as most of you will be to understand what has transpired over the last 10 years in this particular debate. It's only appropriate that I also declare my own position, because we have somebody speaking for the bill, we have somebody speaking against the bill. I have to say that if you go to my website, you will see that I'm a champion for inclusion. In other words, I am absolutely against any form of discrimination, whether it's based on race, religion, or your weight, or your height, or whatever it is. And it's very important to me that I fight for the rights and the human rights of every person in society. Having said that, I am also a Hindu, and I'm a very proud Hindu. I'm a very, I would call, if there's such a thing, a practicing Hindu. In other words, I try to live by the principles of Hinduism. And therefore, my position is in both camps, depending on the debate and the case that they bring forward. Doing my PhD, I've become very, very aware of how you can have a theory, but if you do not have substantial evidence to to support your argument and you do not structure your argument correctly, you will not get the PhD. So therefore, I suggest to both our very distinguished debaters today that they keep that in mind, and that's the kind of way I'm going to run the debate. We're going to have Mr. Satpal speak first, and I will ask some questions for clarity, okay? And it will be, again, to make sure that the argument is explained correctly. And then Dr. Shah will speak. I want us to enjoy this and be informed. So I would like some house rules straight away. There will be no interruptions, and there will be a great deal of respect for each person who speaks, and I would ask the audience to participate. I intend to be as disciplined about my own reactions, so I ask you all to do the same. Okay? Thank you.
I'm actually very delighted to be here to participate in this discussion. It came as a sudden surprise to me. But having had a certain surprise sprung on me, I took the opportunity to be present. And let me thank Vichaar Manthan for organizing this event, and whose ethos, from what I understand, is to share Hindu ideas. It's a platform for earnest thinkers. Very laudable aim. I'm going to take an opportunity, firstly, to express my deepest condolences to the family of Rohit Vemula, a PhD student who tragically committed suicide at the University of Hyderabad in India. And according to media reports, Rohit was a victim of caste discrimination. Let me open up this debate or the address by giving you a brief background about our work, and then hopefully that will contextualize what we represent and what we have been campaigning for. The subject is obviously the caste legislation, and hopefully during the debate, various aspects of that legislation will unfold itself. But caste itself is a taboo subject. Most people don't want to talk about it. Sociologists link taboo with norms and values that society upholds. Norms are cultural products. To some, caste is a sacred norm. And I, again, congratulate the organizers for having the courage to raise the subject of caste at a platform like this. And as Sachin had highlighted, the CasteWatch UK was formed in 2003 to address the issue of caste-based discrimination. And so over the years, we have been campaigning since 2003. Over a number of decades, caste became a hot topic. For example, during our social interactions, questions began to be raised in schools, universities, colleges, and in social relationships. Caste would be discussed in pubs and clubs. I believe there was a pub in Birmingham, and also there's a pub in Bedford, and it was labeled as Chamara the pub. Chamar happens to be categorized as a low-caste community. And there was a case of a shopkeeper in Wolverhampton who served a customer, but the customer refused to take change directly from the hand, just in case they got polluted. And so, although these types of cases were isolated, the intensity of social degradation over a number of years had been increasing. And gradually, caste began to occupy public discourse and began to be discussed openly. The subject of caste became vocalized, especially when religious institutions began to be established along with caste lines And these institutions began to entrench caste divisions in the UK. Of the numerous conferences that CasteWatch UK has organized, we began to hear testimonials directly of people who were affected by caste discrimination. And so CasteWatch UK was formed to address issues raised by people who were perceived as victims of caste discrimination. Let me say this at the outset, that CasteWatch UK as an organization is a secular organization. Okay? We do not have paid workers. We are primarily focused into the UK, and we are not affiliated to any organization operating in the Indian subcontinent or anywhere else in the world. Over the years, our work has caused a lot of difficulties for the conservative elements of the Indian diaspora. And they've been confronting the issue of caste through denials, through vilifications, and indeed, hypocritically, the same elements continue to blame the British for inventing or enforcing the caste construct. They see this as an imperialist, colonialist conspiracy, a subject I will return to, hopefully during the debate. For clarification, our membership is drawn from a wide range of different religious, non-religious backgrounds. We do not persuade or entice or proselytize or seek to convert anyone to any faith or to cause affiliation to any faith. Our statement of policy is published on the CasteWatch UK website. Over the course of the decade, we faced intense opposition from the Hindu section of the community. And in year 2013, an alliance of Hindu organizations was formed. And most recently, we witnessed the emergence of anti-caste legislation committee. The Orthodox Hindus have also inducted the Orthodox sections of the Sikhs into the fray to oppose the equality legislation. Both Hindus and the Orthodox sections of the Sikhs enjoy legal protection against racial and religious discrimination. Caste discrimination is a human rights issue. According to Professor Bhikhu Parekh, caste forms an integral part of Hinduism. It is this social paradigm which the Orthodox Hindus do not want to be removed. If it was not for a caste campaign, then these two groups, the Sikhs and the Hindus, would happily continue to live in their separate existences. But our war on caste has brought the reactionaries out from amongst them to oppose our human rights. Hindus and the Sikhs, the orthodox elements, believe that the destruction of caste is a threat to their faith. I have not known in the UK the vehemence with which the Orthodox Sikhs and the Orthodox Hindus have come together. These groups are often at loggerheads, but want to keep the stinking caste system as a status quo, keep the social paradigm as it is, and not disturb it. To undermine the campaign, both Sikhs and Hindus are playing with legal semantics and called for a legal definition of caste. Leading lawyers argue that a definition of caste is not required in order to provide protection in law. However, there is an explanatory note attached to the Equality Act, which is causing the major offense to the Orthodox Hindus and Orthodox Sikhs. I must express my concern that the Orthodox Hindus and the Sikhs should have nothing to fear. The only person who should be afraid is a person who practices caste discrimination, and only if someone complains to the authorities. The decent law-abiding citizen has nothing to fear. Besides, a law only has a limited remit in that it applies to employment, education, and provision of goods and services. The heavy hand of law only leans on you if there is an offense committed, and if there is a breach of law, and if the offender is caught. Let me explain this briefly, if I am allowed to do so. There is the Dogs Fouling Act of 1996. The Dogs Fouling of Land Act 1996 is an act of parliament of the United Kingdom. The purpose of the act was to create a criminal offense if a dog defecates at any time on a designated land and a person who is in charge of the dog at the time fails to remove the feces from the land. 4 things have to happen before the law is brought to bear. 1, the dog must defecate and the owner not clean up.
Association with this example, because we're running out of time.
Right. The association is that there is a process, there's a due process before anyone who is perceived as breaching the law is apprehended and subjected to the due process of law. So if you are caught by caste discrimination, you have to be caught, you have to be subjected to a due process before you gain justice or the offender is punished. So what I was trying to explain, that this principle applies when law is in place, there is that due process that the offender is subjected to. That's the point I was trying to make, madam. Right. It is argued that those opposing the legislation, that the British Parliament was misled and enacting the legislation in the first place. Well, it is quite strange that the mother of parliamentary democracy is so gullible. Well, if it is gullible some of the time, or does it act on a whim? I don't know what the answer is. But those opposing the caste legislation seem to think that Parliament was misled. Therefore, the provision must be repealed. And as you know, during the election, there was a tremendous campaign of vilification that started against MPs who were supporting the legislation. And this campaign of vilification is continuing to the present day. Now, I could leave it there. Yeah? Okay.
Because we've got a time schedule that we have to stick to.
Okay.
I have been given the privilege to ask for clarity on certain issues, and so I'm going to use this time. There are 2 or 3 things, there are many, many questions we could ask, but I'm going to take your speech in 3 parts. The first part, you built up a case suggesting that there has been a development of social norms towards caste discrimination within the UK. Yeah? But you did not provide any evidence as such. You just merely suggested that the existence of pubs and frequented by particular groups of people who might say something in a derogatory way. That was one evidence. And the second piece of evidence you suggested was the establishment of places of worship. Are you suggesting, Mr. Muman, that I know, for example, when I first came into this country, I don't go to the pub, by the way, as principle, but I remember my husband once said to me, "Oh, we can't go into that pub." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because we're not accepted in that pub." And what he was referring to was racial discrimination or a white majority that was anti-Asian or anti-black. So that's one suggestion. And the other one was this idea of the establishment of religious institutions in this country. Are you suggesting that religious institutions in this country have propagated the caste discrimination as a social norm? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes,
that's what you imply.
That is what I'm suggesting. In terms of the evidence, I'm not here to present, at least I was not aware, but in my argument, I would say that that was in the context of providing the establishment of the CasteWatch UK organization to provide, give the victims who were facing discrimination at whatever level an opportunity to come forward and have somebody listen to them, and so that it became a public discourse. So therefore, that was the reason in terms of the background to the CasteWatch UK. In terms of the evidence...
Mr. Muman, can I just stop you there for a moment? What you are suggesting is that the establishment of Hindu and Sikh places of worship themselves propagates caste discrimination and social norms of caste discrimination. You are suggesting that the establishment of these institutions itself actually propagates caste discrimination, and therefore you are suggesting that these institutions themselves are a problem.
Some of them.
Some or all of them?
Some of them. Well, there has to be, for instance, there is a, it is well known that...
By whom? And where is it documented? It is well known by whom and where is it documented?
Well, let me say that there was a research done by NISA, which you are aware of, and in terms of gathering evidence...
The consultation. You're referring to the government
consultation. And so, as far as evidence gathering is concerned, that was undertaken by the government. And I am not here to present that element of the evidence, because that is something in the public realm, that was something that was done independently. But what I am suggesting is that some of these religious institutions have entrenched the caste divide. And when you...
But that does not come out in the caste consultation document. No government document that I have seen suggests that Hindu and Sikh religious institutions propagate caste discrimination. In fact, quite the reverse, most of them have advocated and said quite categorically that they are against caste discrimination. Is that true? That's what I understand from those documents.
You have to talk to the victims who have faced discrimination, but that's just one element of it.
We're trying to establish that those institutions themselves...
That is an element of it.
Right, so the institutions, you're not accusing Hindu temples and Sikh gurdwaras of being practitioners of caste discrimination, are you?
Not institutions per se, but certainly people have experienced discrimination in those institutions.
Right, okay, so that's clarity there, that the institutions themselves are not propagators of caste discrimination, okay? The second part of your speech was based on I want to focus on the definition of caste. Now, and I've looked at your particular website as well, and I have to say, in 2005, I advocated on behalf of 2 Hindu organizations that you must understand how caste is being understood. Because in Hinduism, there is suggestion that there are 4 varna, but in the Indian legislation, in the Indian government, in the Indian constitution, there is recognition of over 1,000 castes because they are referring to jati. So I would like you to explain to me caste within the Caste UK. On your website, it conflates the two as one. And just to add to this, I have a quote here from you on when Mr. Modi was here, at a press release, you suggested your institute, your organization instituted that younger generation of communities that are victims of caste discrimination in UK have proved all what is the intention of Caste UK if they're not going to define caste, and if they are going to define it in the terms of a Hindu practice, then are we truly being secular or are we actually anti-Hindu? This is something that is coming through this, because Hinduism is targeted in this quote and in the understanding of caste. If it's a jati, then we're talking about social networks. If we're talking about caste as varna, that's Hindu. So which one are we discussing, and what does the caste legislation recognize?
You see, the caste itself is obviously a foreign word. And what we are looking at is the social norms.
Foreign in the sense that it's Portuguese.
Yeah. Yes. So what we are looking at is the Indian or the Indian practice of division of society
along jati,
yes, and also along the varna.
Along
varna. So
means varna, and where is it recognized except in our scriptures or whatever you want to call them, the Vedas?
This is primarily the reason why varna has been raised as something that is connected with the Hindu
But they're not
faith.
the same thing. You recognize that, don't you, Mr. Muman?
Recognize
that's
the
jati and varna are two separate aspects. They have got no connection whatsoever to each other.
Well,
varna is Hindu, scripted through the Vedas and their scriptures, and jati is a social mechanism. And as a sociologist, that's how it would be understood, or anthropology would understand it as a social kinship network. We understand
that.
But on your website as well, they're conflated. Is the caste legislation and the Equalities Act recognizing them as one or two separate ones?
They're intertwined. Both represent.
Is it?
They're both
no,
represent.
they can't be intertwined. One is about a social network, kinship network, and the other one is related directly to Hinduism. So which one are we discussing? And the reason I'm going to talk about this is to my third question and the third part, where you refer to Orthodox Hindus and Sikhs. Now, the word Orthodox, I'm not quite sure how that is appropriate in this context of Hinduism, because practitioners are on a very large spectrum, very long spectrum, in fact. There are people who practice yoga and say that they're practicing Hindus, and then you have people who go off into the Himalayas and take off their clothes, and they're also Hindus. So the spectrum is wide. What do you mean by Orthodox Hindus and Sikhs particularly?
Let me go back to your first question. First question about the varna and jati. Mm-hmm. You see, it's a system of graded inequality. It represents a social paradigm as a hierarchical system, and so therefore
jati or varna, both.
Right. Although varna itself divides the society into four major categories, the jati system is rooted in that same paradigm, in that the society is divided based on a system of graded inequality. Mm-hmm. So therefore, they are both connected.
Right.
That's number one. The second point about the orthodox element of what I referred to is the orthodox element is that element that wants to uphold this system of graded inequality. They are basically the conservative elements that want to hang on to this social paradigm of social inequality.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. Thank you for bringing those two questions together and answering that so clearly. Thank you. We are now going to... Thank you, Mr. Muman.